We are at Evolution Podcast 12. We're about to wrap up speciation by talking about how is it that this reproductive isolation that we just talked about in the previous podcast, how can that even happen? How can we have a population of organisms that's interbreeding with each other suddenly become unable to do that and then separate and go on different evolutionary pathways? Okay. So how can that speciation, that reproductive isolation even happen? Does it just happen overnight? How does that occur? The population, as we already said, has to become reproductively isolated. So let's say we've got a population of bunnies here. All these little specks will be bunnies, okay? And they're all passing their genes back and forth. They're interbreeding, they're having offspring, and those genes they're free to interbreed with each other. So what is it that happens that makes some portion of this population all of a sudden unable to breed back with the rest of it? And then this portion of the population can go on a separate evolutionary track, not sharing genes with this portion of the population, okay? The easiest way to imagine that happening is to geographically isolate one part of the population from the other, physically separate them. And then the two separate little populations who can't breed back can begin going on different evolutionary pathways, such that if we could bring them back together, they would be so different that they couldn't interbreed. That is called allopatric speciation, and you need to remember that term. The other type of speciation occurs when something just pops up within an existing population. There's no physical separation of the organisms from each other. Some genetic mutation just pops up, and the offspring that have this mutation simply cannot breed back with the parent population because the chromosomal situation just isn't right for breeding. This is called sympatric speciation, and you need to know that one too. And we're going to dive into these a little bit with a few examples. Okay, so allopatric speciation is the type of speciation, creation of new species, that occurs when a geographical barrier physically isolates populations. We could imagine a lake that begins to dry up for some reason. And the fish in the lake, as the lake dries up, they get separated from each other, and then one group can go on a different evolutionary path than the other, and you can see becomes different from its original parent population. That's allopatric speciation. Here's a real life example. The Grand Canyon, which you see in the picture here, has a very large chasm from the north rim to the south rim. And that feature has separated a population of squirrels, okay? We have Harris's antelope squirrel and a white-tailed antelope squirrel, one living on the north side of the canyon and one living on the south side of the canyon. I think I have those right. I have them reversed. What happened? Well, as that canyon, the canyon itself separates this population, and to cross that chasm would be quite a feat for such a tiny squirrel. And so the populations simply don't interact with each other. And over many, 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 many years, they became separated, different enough as mutations and so on, sexual recombination differences accumulated within them, that even if they are reintroduced together, they still can't interbreed. A really fantastic example is the Death Valley pupfish. I trust that you are aware that Death Valley is a very dry desert climate. But it was not always that way. It was once rainy and had a whole system of lakes and rivers that ran through it. But drying began a long time ago, about 10,000 years, and the only water sources left in the area are little springs that pop up from the earth itself. That's not rainwater, it's bubbling up mineral springs. And these springs vary in their temperature and in their salinity. So they're very small, and they're not all exactly the same. They're different from each other. Excuse me. In these springs, though, surprisingly, you will find fish in the middle of Death Valley. It's just fascinating that can happen. Each spring has its own little species that is not found anywhere else. They are adapted to that specific salinity, specific mineral content, and everything. Now, these various pupfishes probably didn't start out being all separate species. They probably arose from one ancestral pupfish that lived in all of the bodies of water that existed. But when the range was broken up because of the dry conditions, these little pockets of pupfish took off on different evolutionary paths. Okay, this is also a great example of adaptive radiation, where you have one ancestral species giving rise to several others. The classic example that we've already talked about are Darwin's finches. These pupfish are exactly analogous or homologous. It's the same story. Okay, Darwin's finches. His ancestral fish separated from the mainland. They were isolated. They spread out to the different islands, became isolated to those food sources, and adaptively radiated to fit those islands. So species can arise without that necessity of that geographic barrier. That's called sympatric speciation. So let's imagine our fish population here again, but instead of the lake drying out, the lake doesn't dry out, it doesn't go anywhere. Some fish just are born with a mutation and such that they cannot breed back with their ancestral population, and so they can only breed with each other, and so they create a new species right there in the presence of the old species. Okay, how could that happen? What happens that causes, what kind of mutation would allow them to survive but yet not allow them to breed back with their parent population? Usually this is a chromosomal mutation. In other words, like very often an entire extra set of chromosomes is present in the organism. Okay, we call this polyploidy. Okay, basically polyploid is an accident of cell division, an accident of meiosis. Meiosis doesn't happen properly. And what does occur is you get cells with an extra set of chromosomes. There are two types of polyploidy that we'll talk about: autopolyploidy and allopolyploidy. This first one is polyploidy arising in one single species, whereas allopolyploidy has two species being involved. Okay, so autopolyploidy is when an individual has more than two chromosome sets, so it's more than diploid. You're a diploid organism, so you have two sets of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. Well, this critter would pop up and it's got, 4 sets of chromosomes, and it's all derived from that one species. Okay, and it is a failure of meiosis. In meiosis, the chromosomes don't separate. So let's say that a normal diploid organism with 2 sets of chromosomes, it's 2N, 2 sets of chromosomes, normally makes gametes that are 1N, okay? And 2 gametes recombine to get the 2N back. Well, this organism, that doesn't do that. It makes 2N gametes, which is not right. And if it can self-fertilize, then when it self-fertilizes, it will make 4N or tetraploid cells. Okay, these tetraploid organisms can fertilize itself or perhaps mate with other tetraploids. What they cannot do is mate back with that parent population that has the normal diploid arrangement. Okay, the reason they can't is because a parent species would make normal 1N gametes, like human sperm and egg, for example, or 1N. But if you have these guys, these 4N, who when they go through meiosis will make 2N gametes, right? Then we got to cut the chromosome number in half to 2. So a 1N normal parent gamete with the mutant 2N gamete gives you a 3N zygote. And we just can't have that because 3N offspring are sterile because they've got this unpaired chromosome that results, and you can't have that. So if that happens, then you have achieved reproductive isolation because you can't breed back with your parent generation. You are automatically poof a new species if you have some way to reproduce yourself. Okay, this is extremely common in plants. It is not super common in animals, but it is extremely common in plants, as are all these forms of polyploidy, much less common in animals. Allopolyploidy is more common than what we just talked about, and it results when 2 different species combine their chromosomes. The hybrid that results is usually sterile, okay? But very often the plants can propagate asexually, so you may get a sterile individual, but as long as it's a plant and it can send out runners and with new shoots coming off of them, they can still produce a whole lot of vegetation, okay? Let's talk about an example. A great example of allopolyploidy is a species of salt marsh grass in England that is derived from a European species native to the area. It's called Spartina maritima, or Tima, and an American species that we have right around here, down in the salty parts of the James River and the Chesapeake Bay. This is the main species of salt marsh cordgrass we have. It's called Spartina alterniflora, okay? These 2 species got together and made babies. The invasive for Europe, American species hybridized with that European species. Now, that hybridization created a 3rd species from those 2 different parent species, and this 3rd species cannot breed back with either parent. So let's look at how the chromosomes work. Spartina maritima is a 2N 60 chromosome plant. The alterniflora that lives around here is 2N 62 chromosomes, okay? Well, if you look at the mutant, the hybrid, I should say, form that is the mix of both of them, look what its chromosome number is, 122. 60 plus 62 is 122. What happened is we got a new species created because these didn't undergo meiosis when the sex cells got together. It is a very successful plant. It has become a pest in Europe where it is now taken root, kind of an invasive species. So a real great summary image is this one. Allopatric versus sympatric. This side is allopatric, where you see the geographic barrier is preventing the trees from pollinating one another. Over here, what we see is sympatric speciation, where the new species just pops up right within the parent species, but because of genetic abnormalities, it can't breed back with the parent species. Okay, that's it. We're stopping there, and thank you for watching. I will see you in the next podcast.